This edition of our podcast is brought to you by 360 Health and Well Balanced Nutrition.
Welcome to the Health Geeks Book Club podcast. Listen in as Kristen Norton and Eleanor Russell review all those great health and wellness books you've been wanting to read or you have read and want to talk about. Here's Kristen and Eleanor.
$95 trillion is an almost unimaginable number. Yet this is an estimate of the burden that will be put on our economy by chronic disease over the next 35 years in both direct healthcare costs and lost productivity and disability. This is how Mark Hyman starts his book, Food Fix, and we're talking about it today.
Oh, yes, we are. And Mark Hyman is the head of strategy and innovation for the Cleveland Clinic for Functional Medicine. He's the board president for the Institute for Functional Medicine and founder and director of the Ultra Wellness Center. He's a best-selling author of numerous books, and many of us have seen him on TV or probably seen his podcast. He's a celebrity MD.
I would say so, yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
And we just talked about the Blue Zone in our previous podcast, and you were saying, Eleanor, how this one just...
I think these two books really kind of dovetailed for me, because what Dan Butner did in the Blue Zone was discover these communities or these cultures, these very rare groups of people that are living into their hundreds at a higher proportion than anywhere else on Earth. And they are in remote rural areas mostly, except for Loma Linda, California, which is not too far out of Los Angeles, I understand. And what has happened to these other areas that have been identified as healthy is a Western habit has crept in and is creating a change in habits in the younger populations, the younger generations. So the ability to live into our hundreds may fade away. And what Mark Hyman is saying is we need to reverse this. And I think Dan, I don't know why I call him Ed. Dan Butner is saying the same thing, is instead of making these smaller cultures and letting them disappear, we ought to take lessons from these folks and reverse what we're doing. So what I think Mark Hyman's book, which I think is a very provocative book, a very disturbing book, and it was not a happy read. I loved reading the Blue Zones. That was fun. This book was, hard. Did you think it was a happy read?
Yeah, no, I did not. I think it's one of those, like, the truth will set you free, but first it'll piss you off.
There you go. And maybe cause you to be depressed and hopeless, because that statement you just read about how much money, I mean, if you just want to talk about money, not suffering, and what we could do if we had all that money, we could provide free education to people, we could provide free health care, we could eradicate poverty, we could end food insecurity, solve social justice, income and health disparities, end unemployment, rebuild our infrastructure. I mean, this is what we're giving up for having bad habits. I mean, we could have a much better world. Why are we not doing that?
Oh, my gosh. Well, he goes into
he
all
unpacks
of the
it.
reasons.
He unpacks it, baby.
Yeah, so in the book, it's how to save our health, our economy, and our communities and our planet one bite at a time. But he brings up all the issues that he has trouble with. And frankly, I think it's great that he's calling attention to these things. And we ought to give them the attention they deserve and think about them, even though we don't want to.
Oh, I know. And so what he calls into play here is big pharma, big ag, and big food.
Right. So chapter 1 is the true cost of food, the health, economic, environmental, and climate impact of our food system. And this book is so big that we're just going to focus on this part for right now and have several parts to this podcast, because
we decided it was important enough that we wanted to chunk it up a little bit so you guys don't get too long a seating per conversation.
And we're not, at least I am not very comfortable talking about these subjects because, it's just beyond my scope of what I do from day to day, but thought it was important enough to bring up this conversation.
Oh, yeah.
So.
Yeah, and it gets to be a political conversation, which I do not enjoy getting into.
Exactly.
So I'm just going to read you this one little tidbit here. He says, how does this impact us? All this stuff that we're doing that's causing a huge cost for this chronic disease that's totally most likely is preventable chronic disease, but it's going to cost us a lot. While Democrats argue to create Medicare for all and Republicans argue to reduce entitlements to bring down our $22 trillion national debt, both are missing the obvious fact. Fix the reason why we have those costs in the first place. Stop the flow of sick people into the system and the harm to our environment and climate by fixing the cause, our food system. And that's what I was saying in the blue zones. The food system is very personal. It's not a delivery system. These people were subsistence farmers for the most part, and were preparing all their own food. We're not eating processed foods. And this is what Mark says is we've in our postmodern culture and industrialized culture, or the knowledge. What are we in? Are we in a service industry now? I don't even know what period we're in. However, what we've done is created our own problems instead of maintaining the health style and lifestyle that Dan has described in the blue zones.
So he says, all of us pay the invisible costs. The true costs are not paid for by the food system that generates the costs. We must have a true accounting for this cascade of unintended consequences of our food system, including climate change, depletion of fresh water, forests, and soil, damage to our oceans, loss of biodiversity, pollution, and chronic disease, and its economic burden. This is so heavy. So what do you think, Eleanor, about that true accounting statement?
Yeah, how are you going to do that? I mean, it's going to be difficult to do, but when you start looking around at, let's say, General Electric dumping 1.3 million pounds of polychlorinated biphenyls into the Hudson River, they were eventually held to account and were forced to pay more than $1.7 billion to clean it up. All the costs of food need to be quantified and measured in the same way. And so we're talking about the cost of farm workers. We're talking about the loss of soils. We're talking about, the pollution that goes into the air, that gets into the water.
And all of this, we have
packaging that ends up in the ocean.
And we have, grown so separate from these processes. In the blue zones, they are a part of food. They are growing food. They are farming.
Harvesting it.
They're the ones doing it. But now we just go to the grocery store and we have no idea what it took to get that food there, or who was doing it, or what they were
happened
using
to them,
and what happened to them.
Yeah, what happened to their health status. I remember the story about the chicken processing plants not too long ago where there was some contamination. But what happened Michael Pollan wrote a great book called The Omnivore's Dilemma. Mm-hmm. And sort of, we might do that one day because it's kind of a classic. But one of the stories in there is about if you're going to eat meat, maybe it would be good for you to do the killing and the butchering before you cook it, and then you would appreciate it. And there's stories about Indians killing buffaloes, but giving a prayer to the buffalo for its life, the gratitude for what has happened for us to be able to eat. And I think that's something that we've also lost, is we're not grateful for all the hands that have touched the food that comes to us, and we just grab it, eat it, and run.
Exactly.
And so what's happening to the health of the migrant workers that are picking the food, who are being exposed to herbicides at incredible levels? What about the meat packing plants where people are killing all day long? And they don't just kill one animal, they kill and they kill and they kill. What does that do to their spirits? So there's all sorts of complications that a lot of us just don't take the time to think about.
And it's hard to think about it.
Well, I don't want to do it, and I have chosen not to do it, but I'm so grateful that there are people who do it for me.
Right. Yeah. Well, I was thinking it's just hard to think about it even because of these things that feel out of our control that's happening behind the scenes.
Yeah, well, we were talking about eating antelope earlier in the studio, and I mentioned that my husband had been a hunter, and he was very aware of preparing the meat. So he prepared it for his family to feed his family. And there are a lot of hunters that do that, but there are a lot of trophy hunters that don't do that. Mm-hmm. So, raising a pig, raising a cow, raising goats, the way we have our city structured right now, I don't think a lot of us can do that. If you live downtown Winston-Salem, you're not going to have a goat in the backyard. So we do depend on others to prepare our food. And I actually think, let's give some credit here, I don't think we got in this fix because people were intending to do harm. I think the Green Revolution and the idea that we want to feed the world was a good intention, that we can feed the world. And so all these big companies have come out of that idea that we can grow enough grain, we can make enough produce that we can distribute it around. And so we've built distribution networks and hired people, we've given jobs to people, we've provided for retirement. This is all good. But what Mark Hyman's doing is we need to stop the clock and really see, can we continue this? Because he doesn't think we can continue it. Should we continue it? And what are we going to do if you don't? What do we do?
Right. We can't ignore the unintended consequences.
Exactly. I think enough of us are saying, look at our health status.
So he talks about the destruction of soil and rainforest. Mm-hmm. He talks about the monopoly of the seeds.
Yeah, I think in this first chapter, he kind of does an overview of all this, and then he develops these ideas extensively in the other parts of the book. But yeah, if this is interesting to you guys, I'm Eleanor Russell. I'm 360 Health. I partner with Shackley Corporation. We've always had a mission in our company to provide products that are environmentally sound, who are nutritionally potent, and are safe for people to take. So I know my company is interested in developing good products with good conscience in harmony with nature, because it seems like a lot of companies are doing things that are not in harmony with nature anymore.
And I'm Kristen with Well Balanced Nutrition, where we offer nutrition coaching. We do encourage you to eat locally, connect back with your food, slow down, eat mindfully, and see a little bit of that connection and nourishment from a well-balanced and well-selected diet. You can find more information about well-balanced nutrition at wellbalancednutrition.com.
Yeah, so you were talking about the monopoly of the seeds. We have a company not too far from here, over near Greensboro, named, it used to be named Ciba-Geigy, then it was Syngenta, and now it is Bayer. So Bayer is one of the big suppliers of seeds. And in that conversation, they bring up the big ag. That group would be 4 big companies that are involved in genetically modified seeds. And that would be Bayer, who recently purchased Monsanto, ChemChina, and it's a subsidiary Syngenta. I got that wrong. They're not a part of Bayer. They're part of ChemChina. That rings a bell, doesn't it, China? Corteva, Basif, and they have merged. And so all these companies are merging. And so all the seeds, 1% of the corn grown in America is actually consumed by humans. That's what happens to a lot of seed. It just, it grows plants, but why are we growing all the corn if we're not eating it?
Right. It says the rest is dent corn, used for food oils, animal feed, ethanol, high fructose corn syrup, biodegradable plastic, alcohol, food starch, food additives.
Well, I like this biodegradable plastic.
That's good. Yeah.
That's not bad. But then much of that goes into the CAFOs.
The factory farms?
Yeah, it's the factory farms. And then they talk about, as you mentioned, the destruction of the rainforest and the loss of the world's fresh water. And if we don't have water, we don't have food. And if we don't have food, we don't have humans, right?
Yeah, I mean, in this chapter, he's really building the case.
He is building the case. And then he talks about the fertilizers and how we're putting extra nitrogen everywhere, which is not a good plan. And then he talks about other things like food waste. And so what's happening with all this in the climate? He makes a connection from all these waste generating carbon dioxide up into the atmosphere, which is getting to be a temperature conversation as the Earth's temperature rising or not. It's still an interesting thing, but he brings that up and incorporates it into his conversation. And he talks about the Pharm bill, which has been out there for several modifications. And I never have really paid any attention to the Pharm bill. Have you?
Not really.
No. And in this book, I decided I probably should be paying attention to the Pharm bill and maybe talking to somebody about it. Then he talks about all that corn that we grew getting into high fructose corn syrup, which you mentioned, which goes into these beverages that we've decided everybody has to drink too much of. And soda was not in the blue zones at all. They drank water and wine.
Water and wine.
And maybe vodka. So, just moving these food products around, well, somebody's making a profit on that. And I believe that's what he is talking about. These big companies are making profits, and we need to be talking about fixing it. And he says if we fix it, we'll solve all of these other problems.
Yeah, it's interesting. So he says these solutions exist, and then he goes into them and calls us all to action quite a bit, doesn't he?
Yeah. And on at the end of this section where he talks about and this is kind of a good structure to the book. He gives you a discussion, and then he said, "Here's my ideas on how we fix it." For each section.
Right.
And so to kind of wrap this up, maybe we could go to some of those. He says, start a faith-based wellness program in your place of worship and talk about food and what's healthy food and who are we really supporting, and be an agent for change in your workplace. Like if they've got vending machines that have sodas all around and candy bars, maybe you could talk about some other options. What do you think? Do you think these are ideas? And the idea of food as medicine, do we dare go there?
Well, I like food as medicine, of course, and I think it's very powerful. But yeah, this is some of the good stuff that we'll dive into on the other podcasts that we go into in the Food Fix.
Yeah, I can't wait to develop this more because I'm thinking on it a lot.
Yeah, so this was just a little bit of a teaser, and tune in for our next one as we dive a little deeper.
The views and opinions stated in this podcast are solely those of the contributors and are not necessarily those of our distributors or hosting company. This podcast is copyrighted, and no part can be reproduced without the expressed written consent of Kristen and Eleanor.